Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. The ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP, lost control of Istanbul after 17 years in a rerun of the city's mayoral election. The race was won by the main opposition Republican People's Party, CHP's candidate Ekrem İmamoğlu, by 54.2%.
Main opposition Republican People's Party CHP candidate Ekrem İmamoğlu won the race with 54.2% of the votes and a huge increase of over 800,000 votes on the margin of 13,000 he achieved in the earlier election. İmamoğlu's victory in March was annulled after the ruling Justice and Development Party AKP had alleged irregularities. İmamoğlu said, "The whole of Turkey won the election, not a group or party. You stood up for the democratic tradition of more than 100 years. Thank you, Istanbul," he added. The AKP's candidate, former Prime Minister Binali Yıldırım, who received about 45% of the votes, conceded to his opponent shortly after the unofficial results were announced. Yıldırım said, "My rival seems to be leading the election. I congratulate him. This election showed that democracy is functioning in Turkey. I hope Ekrem İmamoğlu will be of good service to the people. We will help him for his good service." On Twitter, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan wrote, "I congratulate Ekrem İmamoğlu, who has won the election based on preliminary results." President Erdogan, who himself is the former mayor of Istanbul, had previously stated that whoever wins Istanbul wins Turkey. In his victory speech, İmamoğlu said the result marked a new beginning for both the city and the country. He said his supporters had fixed democracy. "We are opening up a new page in Istanbul," he said. "On this new page, there will be justice, equality, and love." He added that he was willing to work with President Erdogan, saying, "Mr. President, I am ready to work in harmony with you." İmamoğlu's supporters took to the streets of Istanbul after the unofficial results were announced Sunday night. Crowds gathered in Beşiktaş, Taksim, Kadıköy, and also Beylikdüzü, where İmamoğlu delivered his victory speech. Prior to being elected Istanbul mayor, İmamoğlu served as the mayor of Istanbul's Beylikdüzü district for 5 years.
Ekrem İmamoğlu took office as the new mayor of Istanbul on Thursday, days after he won the race by a clear margin.
The Provincial Election Council presented the certificate of election to the CHP's Ekrem İmamoğlu at the Çağlayan Courthouse in Istanbul on Thursday. After getting the certificate, İmamoğlu joined a handover ceremony with Istanbul Governor Ali Yerlikaya, who had been serving as the acting mayor of Istanbul. Huge crowds gathered outside the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality building to witness Istanbul's new mayor İmamoğlu take office yesterday. Addressing his supporters outside the municipality building, İmamoğlu promised to be the mayor of everyone regardless of their ethnic and religious backgrounds. "We will distribute the resources of the city equally," he said. "The era of wasting will be over and the age of saving will begin," he added. "The people of Istanbul have confirmed their attachment to the republic and to democracy," İmamoğlu told flag-waving crowds. "This confirmation has shown the world that Turkey isn't any ordinary Middle Eastern country. The belief in democracy runs deep in Turkey's veins." İmamoğlu's victory is seen as a turning point for the country's future, as it ends the AKP's 25-year-old hold on Istanbul.
Joining us in the studio today to talk about whether Istanbul is likely to witness a transformation following Ekrem İmamoğlu's election as Metropolitan Mayor is Paul Benjamin Osterlund, who is an Istanbul-based journalist. Hi, Paul. Welcome to This Week in Turkey.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. So you published an article on Foreign Policy magazine recently in which you drew attention to the rising numbers of locals leaving in Istanbul, and you also quoted words by renowned Professor Timur Kuran, American professor of Turkish origin, and also AKP's mayoral candidate Binali Yıldırım. And what were your observations? What has been causing this outward migration trend, in your opinion?
That's right. So on a televised debate a week before the election, Binali Yıldırım said that because his party and the government had done such a nice job improving infrastructure in Anatolia, that people from Istanbul were moving back to their hometowns and villages. And I kind of felt this was a rather optimistic take. And so I asked Dr. Kuran what he thought, and he also agreed and said that it doesn't have a basis in reality, and that it's more likely that the main factor in this outward migration trend is the deep recession that the country's in the midst of, because frankly, Istanbul has become a very expensive city to live in. As you know, unemployment's very high, inflation's high, rent in Istanbul is very high. So what Dr. Karan told me is that it's most likely people who are unemployed are moving back to Anatolia, to their home villages and towns where they have a support structure of family and friends.
Paul, so you've been living in Istanbul for a long time, for nearly 9 years actually, and you cover culture and lifestyle here. And according to what we read in your foreign policy article, and according to the words of Professor Kuran, we see that this new trend of outward migration has its roots in the deep economic recession that you just quoted yourself. But as a foreign journalist who's been living here for a very long time, what would you say that some of the cultural reasons why people have been leaving the city?
Right. So the second factor that I was going to mention is that, frankly, the city is becoming less of a desirable place to live, or has become less of a desirable place to live over the years, and this is due to the unchecked growth, rampant construction development, and these mega projects that have kind of resulted in the destruction of a lot of the city's remaining green space and forest lands, and then all the ensuing chaos, noise, crowds, pollution that's associated with that. So another major factor is that people with money, freelancers, people who can afford to, are leaving the city, and many are actually going to Izmir and to the Aegean. There was actually an article that was published in The Guardian a few days about this very topic, and I actually read about it a year ago because last year some statistics came out from 2017 that had Izmir as the second city with the fastest rising home prices in the world after Berlin. So number 1 Berlin, number 2 Izmir, which I think is a really kind of striking indicator of this kind of outward migration.
People leaving Istanbul and moving to Izmir.
Moving to Izmir and to the other towns and villages in the province of Izmir.
And Paul, do you see any connection between this outward migration trend, the rising numbers of people leaving the city of Istanbul, and Ekrem İmamoğlu's election as mayor? How do you evaluate the timing?
Yeah, well, I certainly don't think it's a coincidence, and this is why in my article I approached the election using this trend of outward migration in Istanbul, which seems to have just started in 2016. And the numbers in 2018 were particularly striking. Something like close to 600,000 people left the city, while less than 400,000, I believe, moved to the city. So net outward migration figures of around 200,000. That said, this election has been widely discussed as something more than just a mayoral election. At this point, it's become a national issue, perhaps the national issue at the moment. At the same time, I also think we shouldn't kind of underestimate or understate the concern of Istanbul residents and why they voted for why they did.
And Paul, let's focus a bit on İmamoğlu's election promises. And one of his promises was to refuel the city's tourism potential and bring back the European/Western tourists that were once an essential part of the city's tourism scene. How likely is this, in your opinion, from a foreign perspective? What were some of the main reasons why people from the West or from Europe stopped coming here as tourists?
Well, the main reason clearly was 2016, which is a really tough year, a really terrible year for Turkey and for Istanbul. There were a number of terrorist attacks. If that wasn't enough, there was the failed military coup in July of 2016, and that kind of was devastating for the entire country's tourism sector, but I think particularly for Istanbul's. That said, there's already been a rebound. It looks like the numbers of visitors coming to Istanbul increased significantly between 2017 and 2018. And it looks like they're already increasing this year. I was just reading earlier today that Western tourists, the number of Western tourists have increased in the first 4 months of this year already. And it looks like the Istanbul governor had projected that this year would also see an increase in the number of tourists coming to Istanbul. But yeah, also the election can't hurt, because I think the election has kind of helped, shed some positive light on Turkey. Because it seems like all the news that comes out of Turkey is bad news, at least for the past 5-6 years, which is unfortunate because in spite of the political turmoil, Turkey is a wonderful country and a great place to visit, and in spite of, all of this kind of nonstop construction and development, Istanbul is still an absolutely wonderful city to visit. So, even if those numbers fell down, they're already coming up and they'll continue to rise, I think.
So to conclude, Paul, do you think the picture is looking optimistic after Mr. İmamoğlu's election as the new mayor of Istanbul? Are we to witness an urban change, or let me put it like this, a change in the city's urban outlook? How would you evaluate it overall?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a positive step for sure. We'll have to wait and see. Will the outward migration trends reverse? I'm not sure. I would think that as long as the economy is in the condition that it is in, they might not, but yeah, we'll see.
Thank you very much, Paul. Today we were joined by Paul Benjamin Osterlund, who commented on how urban life in Istanbul is likely to change after Ekrem İmamoğlu's election as metropolitan mayor, and now we'll continue with our next news video. Hundreds gathered at Istanbul's main court today to support opposition politician Canan Kaftancıoğlu, who faces 17 years in prison for a series of tweets criticizing the government. Kaftancıoğlu, who heads the main opposition Republican People's Party, CHP's Istanbul branch, is accused of insulting President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the Turkish state in tweets posted between 2012 and 2017. Kaftancıoğlu was a key figure in the campaign to elect Ekrem İmamoğlu, the new CHP mayor of Istanbul, whose landslide victory this week marked the first significant defeat for Erdogan since he took power in 2003. A landmark trial against 16 people accused of organizing and financing the Gezi Park protests of 2013 and attempting to overthrow the government began in Istanbul on Monday. The court ruled on Tuesday that businessman and philanthropist Osman Kavala to remain in custody, while civil society expert Yiğit Aksakoğlu was released, although his trial will continue.
Two of the accused, renowned businessman and rights activist Osman Kavala and prominent NGO worker Yiğit Aksakoğlu, were being held in Istanbul's high-security Silivri prison, where the courthouse housing the trial is located. Following Aksakoğlu's release, the next hearing will take place on July 18th and 19th in Istanbul. In his opening statement to the court, Kavala rejected the irrational claims which lack evidence. "I was involved in projects contributing to peace and reconciliation. There is not a single piece of evidence or proof in the indictment that I prepared the ground for a military coup," Kavala told the court. The Istanbul Chief Public Prosecutor's Office had sent the Gezi Park indictment to the Istanbul 30th High Criminal Court on March 4th, recommending aggravated life term for 16 defendants charged with an attempt to overthrow the Turkish government. In the summer of 2013, relatively small demonstrations in Istanbul's Gezi Park grew into a nationwide wave of protests against the government that left 8 protesters and a police officer dead.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said on Wednesday that US President Donald Trump has not given any indication that he intends to impose sanctions against Ankara over its purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense systems.
So far in my conversations with President Trump, I didn't get the impression that the United States would sanction Turkey over the S-400 purchase. Only lower-level officials bring that up, President Erdogan told reporters ahead of his trip to Osaka, Japan, to attend the G20 summit. "I didn't know that NATO allies had started to sanction each other," he added. Turkey's planned purchase of the S-400 system has strained ties with the United States, which says the systems are not compatible with NATO equipment and may compromise its F-35 fighter jets. Washington has warned of possible US sanctions if Ankara follows through with the Russian deal, but Ankara has repeatedly stated the S-400 purchase is a done deal. Erdogan said Ankara was merely waiting on the delivery of the missile systems, a topic that he plans to discuss with his counterpart Trump in the G20 summit in Japan. President Erdogan also said that he would discuss Syria with Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the summit. "The attacks in Idlib are ongoing," Erdogan said, adding that Ankara would continue to push for the creation of a safe zone at the presidential and foreign ministerial levels. Turkey and Russia signed a deal last September to prevent an offensive against the rebel forces in Idlib, which is the last opposition-controlled province in the country. Russia has accused Turkey of failing to clear the region of the jihadist opposition group Heyet Tahrir-i Sham and thus failing to fulfill the terms of the agreement. Erdogan also touched on the struggle for rich gas reserves in the eastern Mediterranean. He said that Ankara had a say over drilling in the region and questioned whether the United States had such a right. We have a right as a guarantor. There are 3 countries which have a right of say on this matter, Erdogan said. Tensions have been soaring between Turkey, Cyprus and Greece over offshore drilling for oil and gas. European Union member states and US officials have objected to Turkey's increasing drilling efforts in the region.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.